All right, good morning, guys. I just wanted to make a few more quick statements on the scenario that we received a few days ago. And you guys are going to be receiving today a few additional shorter scenarios just to kind of consider the rest of the checks on the Supreme Court and how other branches of the government have um, historically responded to the power of the courts. Uh, but today we're going to just kind of recap and go into a little more detail on some of the powers and checks that occurred in this specific historical scenario. So, one of the main takeaways here is that the courts, their power relies almost entirely on their reputation. In other words, if people see the courts as legitimate, as impartial, as acting in the best interest of the country, then the court's powers will be immense, right? Because the power of judicial review is significant. But if the courts are seen as political, as illegitimate, as um, just another mechanism of corruption, then their power is going to be weak. And the reason for this is what Alexander Hamilton says here in Federalist 78. And I'm going to go ahead and read that for you from page 191 of your AMSCO book. The very first line that's quoted here from Hamilton's Federalist 78. The judiciary will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them being the political rights in the Constitution. Um, it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them since it has no influence over either the sword or the purse. Um, so they have no mechanisms for enforcement, right? They only make decisions, but they don't enforce those decisions. They depend on the other branches to do that. So um, if the other branches, or rather, if the court is in the public eye seen as reputable and legitimate, then the other branches cannot really go against it because it'll hurt them in elections, right? If if everybody thought the Midnight Judges Act was a really good idea and everybody saw Adams' appointments as being fair and legitimate, the repeal of the Midnight Judges Act would have been seen as a power grab. It would have been wildly unpopular. But the Midnight Judges Act, as you guys saw in the readings, was just, it was so unpopular. It was seen as a power grab by the Federalists to kind of undermine the principles of democracy, right? They had lost the election, and after they lost the election, then they packed the courts, right? So they said, oh, well, we want to hold on to power even though the people have spoken against us. They don't want our agenda anymore. So in that case, attacking the courts, not only was it politically expedient, right? Like it helped them politically, but it would have been dangerous politically to not do anything about the courts, because people were writing their congressmen letters and petitions telling them to do something about this because they didn't like what Adams and the Federalists had done. We fast forward to the Marshall decision, of course, and the Marshall decision, there's a huge contrast here. Marshall actually sides with his political enemies. He was a Federalist, right? And he sides with the Democratic Republicans. He refuses to appoint somebody who he himself tried to get appointed. And this can only be seen, from a passive looker by as an impartial judgment. So, aside from the fact that really, Jefferson won the case, so there's really nothing he could do to undermine Marshall's decision. It was a pretty safe move for Marshall to make. But because of this, the public pretty much acknowledged the legitimacy of the court and their and it set the precedent, because the public accepted it and the other branches didn't do anything about it, that the court did have the power of judicial review. Now, let's go ahead and look at what else happened, right? Because something that wasn't discussed, and this is important here. So something that wasn't discussed in the document that I sent you was the consequences of the repeal. It did remove all of those inferior court justices, and it did remove all those circuit courts that were given jurisdiction over the states. But there is one other thing that is really important here, in that when they repealed the Act of 1801, the Judiciary Act of 1801, they also reinstated the Judiciary Act of 1789. And, one just kind of took the place of the other. And if you remember, part of the Judiciary Act of 1801 was to remove one Supreme Court justice. And since one Supreme Court justice had been removed, when they went back to the Act of 1789, it added that sixth judge back to the Supreme Court. So one judge got removed. Now they have to replace another one. Well, who gets to choose that judge? Thomas Jefferson does, right? So now the Supreme Court isn't entirely stacked with Federalist judges anymore. Thomas Jefferson gets to pick his own guy to be in there. So changing the size of the Supreme Court, that's another mechanism to, to gain influence, for a political party to gain influence over the courts. Of course, Congress, again, has to pass legislation to do it, and then the president has to be the one to appoint them. So you need a unified government for this to work, in the sense of political aims. I mean, and of course, the Senate has that appointment power, or they have to approve any appointment that the president makes. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's very difficult for one party to just kind of take over the courts completely. We're going to see this when we look at FDR and his own court packing scheme. But the second thing that they did was the Democratic Republicans, while Thomas Jefferson was president, actually tried to impeach several judges and successfully impeached one of them. The first guy that they impeached, he was an alcoholic and openly political, more so than other justices at the time. So really, it was, he was political and he was an alcoholic. They decided that these violated the serving during good behavior clause, and they found grounds to actually get rid of them. They impeached them and removed them. So you could make an argument that being an alcoholic is not a good enough reason. It's a moral failing. It's not, you could argue that it's a moral failing. So it's not necessarily a grounds for impeachment. If Bill Clinton didn't get impeached for, his actions in the White House, then why should a Supreme Court justice get impeached for another vice, right? But it's most people would agree that the actions were partly politically motivated in the impeachments. They didn't like that the courts were stacked. They didn't like that they didn't have total control over the government, the Democratic Republicans. So they tried to impeach another justice, Justice Chase, a little bit later. And they had much weaker grounds on impeaching him. And Thomas Jefferson does eventually say, we don't want to, this is a dangerous precedent to set, to be able to just impeach judges for political reasons. So he kind of stepped back and he made the decision to not go forward with that impeachment. And of course, this just shows you the power of the president as party leader, right? Because ultimately, the president really has no say in whether or not anybody's going to get impeached. But he told his party to back off, and they listened, right? So that's the power, again, of the president being the leader of his political party, the chief of the party, right? So these are just a few checks. Now, and of course, every time somebody gets impeached, Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republican, gets to replace them. So by the end of his tenure, he got to by the actions of Congress, replace 2 Supreme Court justices. So that's all I have for you guys today. I'm going to be putting a few more videos up, and hopefully these are helpful to you. If you have any questions, go ahead and email me, and we'll get those sorted out. All right, guys, I hope you have a wonderful day, and this is me signing off.